All right, cool. So, Chris said, I'm James Baker. My friends call me Jay. I'm on the organizing committee of Chattanooga DSA. Just very excited to be here. Glad some folks actually turned out to hear about these words. They're kind of scary sometimes, at least how they've been portrayed in the Western world, particularly in the U.S. There's just been decades of fear-mongering and propaganda that just really have sort of muddied the waters on what the terms actually mean. Like, just talking with your average person, most people don't actually know just, dictionary definition of what these words mean, let alone if they think they're a good thing or a bad thing. They just don't even know what they are. So the fact you're out here trying to get educated, maybe you already know, maybe you'll learn something new, hopefully. But let's just dive right in. So socialism is working class ownership and control of the means of production and distribution. It's a lot of words there, but we're going to break down all of that and hopefully make it more bite-sized and easy to understand. Likewise, it doesn't make sense to talk about socialism without mentioning capitalism. So socialism and capitalism are both economic modes of production. They're ways you can organize the economy of a society, right? Right now, obviously, we live under capitalism, which is private ownership and control of the means of production, and specifically using them to generate profit for those private owners, right? So we see here the first distinction we're going to make is class-based, right? In socialism, it's the workers that control and own the means of production. And capitalism, it's private owners, whoever has got that money, inherited it, or bought it from someone. Most people intuitively have a pretty good understanding of what capitalism is because that's the system that we live under now. So let's dive in some more, right? So socialism and capitalism, both of these, we're talking about means of production. What is this means of production? If you read Marx or you talk to leftists, you'll hear this a lot. They'll talk about seizing it or controlling it. But means of production are basically things that we're going to use for an economic purpose. So it's factories, right? It's delivery trucks. It's the computers at your office. I work in IT, so the computer that I work on is a means of production, right? It's the things that we're going to use to produce commodities. And just real quickly, commodities are things that are produced in an economy, right? If I grow some tomatoes in my backyard to eat for lunch, just my own personal use, those are not commodities, right? Those are just personal things that I've done. If I grow them and take them to the market to sell them, they're commodities because they're being used for an economic purpose, right? So, sorry, it's kind of you come to a socialism event thinking you're going to learn some radical stuff, but it's really just economics. Can be kind of boring. But yeah, so this is the means of production, right? So socialism is the working class owning and controlling this stuff, right? What's the things that in our society are used to produce commodities, right? And capitalism, again, is private ownership. Just whoever has the money to, or has inherited it, that's who is determining how those things are used. So what is class, right? We've just sort of made this distinction between capitalism and socialism, where capitalism is private ownership, but socialism is a class, owning things collectively in some kind of sense, depending on your flavor of socialism. A class is a group of people that have an intrinsic shared interest that's often in opposition to other classes, right? So if we think about, say, feudalism, right? You have the peasants, serfdom. You've got nobility, you've got the knights, you've got maybe some citizens and artisans in town. And these are all different classes, and they all have different opposing interests. Let's not get there yet. Under maybe like ancient society, you might have had masters and slaves, right? And like your god emperor, and the priest class. Under capitalism, we really have two classes. But before we get to defining them, saying what they are, how are we going to define them, right? So Karl Marx was a materialist philosopher. He's also into dialectics. He was a student, a fan of Hegel, which don't worry, we're not going to talk about Hegel. But, yeah, no kidding. Basically, if we're going to look at class, we're going to look at society, and we're going to decide, what kind of society do we have? What type of mode of production do we have? We need to do it materially, right? So who controls the means of production? Who controls the factories, right? Who gets to decide what cars get made at the Ford factory? Is it the workers? Is it Mr. Ford who owns it? Is it some board of directors? Who decides what commodities get produced, right? Under feudalism, who's deciding, what crops are getting planted?
The lords.
Yeah, exactly. Under slavery, who is deciding, how the labor of the slave is used? The masters, right? Under capitalism, who is deciding these things, right? And finally, who decides how commodities get distributed, right? So in society, we're going to do some labor using our means of production and produce commodities, which is products, right? And services, I guess, too. So we've made a bunch of cars. Who gets the cars that we just made, right? Under capitalism, they're sold on a market, right? Under feudalism, might be some sort of mixed market thing. Maybe the Lord portions things out as he sees fit, that sort of thing. So that's like a key part. We've just barely scratched the surface here, but material analysis is a key part of socialism, right? We're not just going to say, this is the society we want because we feel like it's nice. It would be good, it makes me feel good inside. It's like, no, hold on, we're going to actually, like scientists, like economists, we're going to look at who's controlling things, what is getting produced, how much of it, that sort of thing. So, now that we know what is going to distinguish our classes, right? We're going to do it based on a material analysis, who's controlling things, who's performing the labor, who is getting to make the decisions about what is produced and how it is distributed. Really, under the capitalist mode of production, there are fundamentally really just two classes, right? You've got the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The ruling class, the capitalist class, and the working class. The bourgeoisie, aka the capitalist class, these are the people that own the means of production. This is the board of shareholders that owns the factory. This is the small business owner. This is the sole proprietorship. Whoever has some sheet of paper that says they own that company, they own those resources, they own that factory. That is the bourgeoisie, the capitalist class. If you have capital, right? If you have capital, if you control these, if you own a factory or any of these things, or have the money to acquire them or rent them or whatever, then you're in the bourgeoisie. Which is a French word, by the way. And then you've got, presumably, all of us in this room. It's the proletariat, the working class. Does anyone here own an industrial factory? No, any small business owners? Get them. Take them out, Jean Marie.
That's the fork and knife.
That's right.
Petty.
Right. We don't own any capital, so we are not capitalists. We are proletarians. We're workers, right? We have to sell our labor as a commodity on the market, right? Because we don't have access to the means of production or to any commodities produced by them. So if we want anything made in our economic mode of production, we have to sell our labor, which is not fun. It's not fun. So whenever you talk about proletariat and bourgeoisie, working class, capitalist class, there's just some common things that people usually say to me. Well, what about the middle class? I always thought I was middle class. I didn't think I was working class. Well, middle class, upper class, lower class, upper middle, class, all of these things, these are all bourgeois conceptions of class based on income, right? Fundamentally, if we're doing a material analysis, the main distinction that matters in regard to a mode of production for class is who has power, who has control, right? Like, just because I happen to work in IT, and it pays a bit better than other forms of labor. I can sell my labor power as a commodity for a higher rate, but I don't get to decide what I'm making. I'm still selling my labor for a wage just like anyone else. It just happens to draw a higher wage at this time. In my previous job, it was a much lower wage. So, like all these different classes that we're told about, upper middle class, lower working class, whatever, they're just, it's basically bourgeois propaganda. I don't know how else to put it, right? It's made to divide the working class further. Because fundamentally, the well-paid IT worker has more in common with the underpaid janitor at the company than he does with the management or the boss, right? And then another typical complaint is, what about other identities like gender and race, religion, national origin, that type of thing? Those are all valid, and modern socialism is going to be intersectional. And I think, were you going to talk about any intersectional stuff, Trish? Because I don't want to
A
mess it
little
up.
bit,
if you
it's
are.
kind of like
Yeah.
on my list, if this doesn't get covered. then-
Okay, cool. Basically, I won't go into it much other than to say, if you're going to be a good socialist, you need to have absolute solidarity with oppressed peoples everywhere, regardless of how they're oppressed, right? So, yeah, we'll just leave it at that. And then some of the stuff gets kind of fuzzy, like, what about managers? They might not own any, they might not have a stake of ownership in the factory, right? Aren't they workers too? They're just trading away their, management labor for a wage, just like you are. Well, except that they're, specifically on the side of the capitalist class, right? If you try to form a union, are you going to tell the manager about it? No. But they've chosen, even though they may not technically, have enough capital to be capitalists themselves, they're working in service to the capitalist class. So I would say no, they're not part of the working class. Same goes for police. They're there to guard the wealth of the capitalist class, right? If you're hungry, your family's hungry, and you need some food, and you go and take some food, and someone calls the police, who are they going to side with? Right, whoever owns it, the store owner, not the people who are starting. Same thing. So we'll just carry on. I don't want to take too long here. So this brings us to another concept from Marx called historical materialism, right? So we said earlier Marx was a materialist, which means we're going to just look at the physical world. We're not going to start with some theory on high and extrapolate from that. We're just going to see, hey, what can we observe about the world, and then let's build up from there. So kind of like a scientist, at the time, Darwin was also a contemporary. It was like a scientific revolution in a sense that this is how people were starting to look at the world, as opposed to just, history is just what some king said 200 years ago, or what the ancient philosophers wrote down in Greece. Really, history, according to Marx, is class struggle, right? It's not the, you may have heard this form of history called big man theory, right? Where history is driven by, and if you, like, for instance, if you learn about World War II primarily through, okay, this is what Hitler decided to do, and then this is what these other world leaders decided to do, and that's how everything happened. Like, well, they were definitely a part of it, but the conditions that led to, say, World War II, or any war, or any events in history, are driven primarily by, according to Marx, class struggle. Right? So remember we talked about feudalism and slavery under ancient society earlier. Both of those systems were about class struggle. A good example would be, say, the French Revolution or the American Revolution, which were basically bourgeois revolutions, right? It was the citizen class, the artisans, the business owner class, exerting their dominance and power over the nobility class, right? And socialism is the working class exerting their power and dominance over the proletarian class, or the bourgeois class, the capitalist class. Too many terms here. It was a good idea to bring note cards. I see a lot of people using them. That's cool. So yeah, just I don't want to dig too much into this. It's its own whole topic. You could write a whole book on it. But just something to keep in mind. Class struggle is a big part of a socialist, sort of Marxist view of history. And here's another distinction. Something else I typically hear a lot is if you listen to any conservative politicians, pretty much anything the government does is socialist. And even more social democrats will say, "Oh, you like roads, don't you? Roads are socialist, so yeah, socialism's good." It's a common thing you'll hear, which roads are good, but a government building roads is not socialism. Socialism is not just anything a government does. Socialism, I don't want to click through all the slides, but if you'll recall, is working class ownership and control of the means of production and distribution. If it's not that, it's not socialism, right? There's a lot of ways you could have that. And a lot of ways people think we ought to have that and ought to get to that, which is the whole reason this topic is on 3 different ideologies instead of just one, because we don't always agree on how to get these things. But no, not only is everything the government does not socialism, liberals are also not socialists. They can be cool, we can be friends, even allies sometimes, but fundamentally it's separate ideologies. And another classic thing that you'll hear, what about Hitler? His party was the National Socialist Party. Right? It's got socialist right in the name. They're socialists. It's like, well, it is right in the name, that's true. But it's not working class ownership and control of the means of production and distribution, right? Like, you could argue, well, maybe it kind of is just for white people, but that's not working class either. Then then it's just white working class control of these things, and that's not what we want. So, in short, no, Nazis were not socialists. They just, as conservatives and reactionaries often do throughout history, they appropriate the language of revolutionaries to make themselves more appealing. And so, I'm sure some of you guys have seen some memes about this chart right here, potentially. But it is, it's limited in value, but I think it's useful, at least on a base level, to discuss these things. So, on this scale, we've got, on our x-axis, we've got economic right and economic left. So, all the way over here, this would be, complete, collective ownership of private property, right? There is no economic property, like, remember our tomato example, right? Tomatoes you just grow for yourself are not commodities. Tomatoes you grow for the market are commodities, right? So likewise, property used for personal use, your toothbrush, your housing, your clothes, that's personal property. And property used for the production of commodities, like a factory or that sort of thing, that's private property, right? So all the way over here, economic left would be no private property. All private property, or all economic property, is owned collectively in some fashion by the working class. Economic right is the opposite of that, the other extreme. No collective property, no state parks, no public streets, no libraries. Everything is owned by capital, people who have capital, right? And then we have on this other scale, the y-axis, we have authoritarianism. So how much does the state enforce this axis, right? So at the very top would be total authoritarian regime. Think Nazi Germany, that sort of thing. Whereas at the bottom, there's like practically no state enforcement of the economic system or any other rules, right? So something a lot of liberals fail to understand is that they are here, right? Somewhere around here. So we've got a relatively large amount of authoritarianism in our government, right? The state is enforcing through violence, because the state, that's how the state enforces anything, is through violence. We have a relatively large amount of that, and we're on the economic right. So up here is going to be, you know, Hitler, Mussolini, all your classic fascist dictators, and just generally nasty people that we all don't like. And then down here is going to be Republicans, and down here is going to be Democrats, and down here is going to be like progressives. But they're all in the authoritarian right as far as economic, like amount of state power, amount of private versus collective ownership in the economy. So socialism is neither of these two, right? Anything over here can be called socialism, in my opinion, right? So, you know, the authoritarian left, you know, getting more towards like your Soviet Union, China under Mao, you know, North Korea, and then down here is where anarchists live. So yeah, just, you know, hopefully that'll put things in perspective. I'm not going to try and make any, you know, value judgments here while we're just in a, you know, friendly forum about which is preferable. But if you're on the economic right, you're not a socialist, all right? And down here is your right libertarians. At the far, you know, bottom corner is your anarcho-capitalists, which pretty much nobody likes them, so we can make fun of them. That's fine. They believe in total private ownership of everything and no state to enforce that either, which it just wouldn't work for one thing. But it's also, you
Now,
know,
I've
that
seen
boring.
Mad Max, and I think anarcho-capitalism can work.
It would
That's
certainly
for the
make for
Q&A
good cinema, that's for sure. All right. So here's a couple other phrases. I'm like, how am I on time? Am I
You are over
Yeah.
typical?
by quite a bit.
Oh,
I don't know how much,
probably.
but it's been 10 minutes since I last checked.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess we'll skip those. You can ask about those in the questions if you want.
I mean, I'm talking about dictatorship of the proletariat.
Okay. Well, I'll leave it for you then. But yeah, here's a few different types of socialists. I won't really go into it other than to say DSA is this top one here, Democratic Socialists. You know, we also want collective ownership. We want working class control and ownership of the means of production. We just want to achieve that democratically. We want to win elections, all right, and use the existing state apparatus to achieve those goals. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that so I'm not taking up any more time. And